I've always been drawn to the sea, its vastness and mystery, a perfect match for my own restless spirit. So when I found an off-grid lighthouse available for rent in Maine, it seemed like the ideal place to isolate myself and finally complete my novel. The lighthouse stood tall and solitary on a rocky outcrop, surrounded by the endless expanse of the ocean. It was the perfect escape from the distractions of modern life. I arrived in late autumn, the air crisp and the waves crashing against the rocks with a kind of relentless energy that I found invigorating. The lighthouse itself was old but sturdy, with walls that had weathered countless storms. It was equipped with just the basics: a small kitchen, a bedroom, and the lantern room at the top. The place had a certain charm, an old-world feel that suited my needs perfectly. For the first few days, I settled into a routine. I would wake up early, make a pot of coffee, and write until the sun set. The isolation was inspiring, the perfect backdrop for my creativity. The only sounds were the cries of the gulls and the rhythmic pounding of the waves. It was as if time had slowed down, allowing me to focus solely on my work. But then, on the fourth night, something strange happened. I had just finished a long writing session and was getting ready for bed when I noticed a faint light on the horizon. It was barely visible, a small pinprick of brightness in the darkness of the ocean. I watched it for a while, but it didn't seem to move or change. Thinking it might be a distant ship or a reflection of the moon, I shrugged it off and went to bed. The next night, the light appeared again, this time a little closer. I stood at the window, staring out at the ocean, trying to make sense of it. It was almost midnight, and the light was more pronounced, a steady glow that seemed to hover just above the water. I listened carefully, but the only sounds were the usual ones: the wind, the waves, the distant call of a bird. I told myself it was nothing, probably a fishing boat or some kind of navigational buoy. On the sixth night, things took a turn for the eerie. I was in the lantern room, reading by the light of an old oil lamp, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a distant, mournful wail, like the cry of a lost soul. I froze, listening intently, but the sound faded into the wind. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination, but the unease lingered. That night, the light was closer still, and this time it was accompanied by the unmistakable sounds of a ship in distress: creaking timbers, the clanging of a bell, and the faint, desperate cries of sailors. I stared out at the ocean, my heart pounding. The light was so close now that I could see it flickering, as if someone were signaling from a lantern. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, listening to the eerie sounds and watching the light, which seemed to pulse with a life of its own. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a ghost ship? Some kind of supernatural phenomenon? I tried to rationalize it, but the more I thought about it, the more unnerved I became. The next day, I ventured into the nearby town to gather supplies and ask around. The locals were friendly enough, but when I mentioned the light, their expressions changed. An old fisherman at the general store looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "You're staying at the old lighthouse, aren't you?" he asked. I nodded. He shook his head. "There's been stories about that place. They say it's haunted by the spirits of sailors who perished in a shipwreck many years ago. They see a light on the ocean, just like you described. It gets closer each night, and with it, the sounds of the shipwreck." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What happened to the ship?" The fisherman shrugged. "No one knows for sure. Some say it was a smuggler's ship that ran aground in a storm. Others say it was a naval vessel. All I know is, those who see the light don't stay at the lighthouse for long." I left the store with a heavy heart, my mind racing with thoughts of ghosts and shipwrecks. When I returned to the lighthouse, I tried to focus on my writing, but my mind kept drifting back to the light and the sounds. That night, I stayed up, waiting for the light to appear. Sure enough, at the stroke of midnight, the light appeared on the horizon. It was closer than ever, and the sounds were louder, more distinct. I could hear the splintering of wood, the shouts of men, and the eerie tolling of a bell. I stood at the window, transfixed, unable to look away. As the light approached, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the air itself was charged with some dark energy. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things in a frenzy, my hands shaking with fear. The light was almost upon the shore now, and the sounds of the shipwreck were deafening. It felt like the lighthouse was surrounded by the ghostly remains of the ship and its crew. I fled into the night, not daring to look back. I drove through the darkness, the image of the light seared into my mind. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of a hotel in the next town. There, I collapsed onto the bed, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The next day, I contacted the owner of the lighthouse and explained that I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't go into details, just said that I had to leave. They didn't seem surprised, and I wondered how many others had experienced the same thing. I never did find out the source of the light or the truth behind the haunting. I abandoned my work on the novel, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had taken hold of me. The memory of the phantom light and the sounds of the shipwreck haunted me, a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors that lurk in the depths of the ocean. Even now, I can still see the light in my mind's eye, flickering on the horizon, drawing closer with each passing night. I can still hear the cries of the sailors and the mournful tolling of the bell. And I know that no matter how far I run, I will never escape the phantom light that haunts the shores of Maine. It seemed like a great idea at the time. My friends and I were always looking for new and unique experiences, and when Chris suggested we spend a few nights in an abandoned asylum in upstate New York, we all jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be an adventure, a thrilling escape from our everyday lives. Little did we know, it would become a nightmare we would never forget. We arrived at the asylum on a crisp autumn afternoon. The building loomed before us, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The windows were shattered, the doors hanging on rusted hinges. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but that only added to the allure. We were armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last a few days. Spirits were high as we made our way inside. The interior was even more decrepit than the exterior. The walls were peeling, and the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. We set up our sleeping bags in what must have once been the main hall, a vast, echoing space that felt strangely oppressive. As the sun set, we gathered around a makeshift campfire, telling ghost stories and laughing nervously at the creaks and groans of the old building. It was around midnight when we first heard it, a faint, distant cry that seemed to come from deep within the asylum. We all froze, the laughter dying on our lips. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We nodded, straining our ears. The cry came again, louder this time, a plaintive wail that sent chills down my spine. We exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to admit they were scared. Chris, always the brave one, suggested we investigate. "Come on, it's probably just the wind," he said, grabbing his flashlight. "Let's check it out." Reluctantly, we followed him, our footsteps echoing eerily in the dark, silent halls. The cries grew louder as we ventured deeper into the asylum, leading us to a set of stairs that descended into the basement. The air grew colder, and the sense of dread intensified. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the cries suddenly stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that was even more unnerving. We found ourselves in a long, narrow corridor lined with doors. Most of them were locked or jammed shut, but one door at the far end was slightly ajar. Chris pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with old patient records. The walls were covered in yellowing papers, and a large, dusty desk stood in the center, cluttered with files and notebooks. We began to sift through the records, our curiosity piqued despite our fear. The files detailed horrifying experiments conducted on the patients, electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other inhumane treatments. The more we read, the more disturbed we became. These weren't just stories. These were real people who had suffered unimaginable horrors within these walls. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, and the room plunged into darkness. We all screamed, our flashlights flickering wildly as we fumbled to find the door. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence in the room with us, something malevolent and angry. The cries began again, louder and more desperate. echoing off the walls and filling the small space with an overwhelming sense of despair. We managed to pry the door open and stumbled back into the corridor, our hearts racing with fear. The shadows seemed to move, and I caught glimpses of fleeting apparitions, pale, ghostly figures that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. We ran back up the stairs, desperate to escape the basement and the horrors it contained. As we reached the main hall, we realized we were not alone. The ghostly figures were everywhere, their mournful cries echoing through the building. They moved towards us, their faces twisted in agony and rage. We grabbed our belongings and fled the asylum, not daring to look back. The cries followed us into the night, fading only when we reached the safety of our car. We drove away in silence, the weight of what we had experienced settling heavily upon us. None of us spoke until we were miles away from the asylum, the eerie silence replaced by the hum of the car engine. It was Chris who finally broke the silence. "We're never going back there," he said, his voice trembling. "Ever." We all nodded in agreement, the memory of the haunted asylum etched into our minds. The adventure we had sought had turned into a nightmare, a brush with the supernatural that we would never forget. The cries, the apparitions, and the horrifying records of the patients haunted our dreams for months afterward, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked within the abandoned walls of the asylum. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that we were lucky to escape with our lives. The asylum still stands, a silent sentinel in the New York hills, its dark secrets hidden within its decaying walls. And though we vowed never to return, a part of me wonders what would have happened if we had stayed. What other horrors lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered? It's a question I hope never to answer, for some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried in the past. Moving to the secluded farmhouse in the West Virginia hills seemed like a dream come true for our family. After years of city living, my wife, Emily, and I were eager to provide a quieter, more natural environment for our children, Lucas and Abby. The farmhouse was old but charming, nestled in a picturesque valley surrounded by dense woods. We were captivated by the beauty and tranquility of the place, and the idea of living off the grid and reconnecting with nature felt like the perfect antidote to our hectic urban lives. We arrived in early summer, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers. The farmhouse, with its weathered wooden exterior and cozy interior, felt like a haven. The kids were thrilled, running around the expansive yard and exploring the nearby woods. The first few days were filled with unpacking, settling in, and marveling at the serenity of our new home. As the days turned into weeks, we began to notice peculiar things. It started with faint noises at night, barely audible whispers carried on the wind. At first, I chalked it up to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside, animals, insects, the creaking of the old house. But as the nights wore on, the sounds became more distinct and unsettling. It wasn't just the usual nocturnal cacophony, it was something else, something that seemed almost intentional. One evening, as we sat on the porch enjoying the sunset, Lucas pointed to a cluster of trees near the edge of the woods. "Dad, what are those marks on the trees?" he asked. Curious, we all walked over to investigate. The trees were covered in old cryptic carvings, symbols and patterns that none of us could decipher. They were weathered and worn, clearly made a long time ago. Emily and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we tried to reassure the kids. "Probably just old markings from when people used to live here," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. As the weeks went by, the strange occurrences increased. We would hear footsteps in the woods at night, faint but unmistakable. Lucas and Abby, once eager to explore, began to avoid the forest, claiming they felt like they were being watched. Emily and I dismissed it as their overactive imaginations, but deep down, we both felt the growing sense of unease. One afternoon, while clearing some brush behind the house, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Hidden beneath a tangle of vines and roots was a small, ancient burial ground. The gravestones were crude and unmarked, the earth around them disturbed as if something had recently been uncovered. I called Emily over, and we stared at the graves in horrified silence. "This is unsettling," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We should report this to someone, I suggested, though I wasn't sure who we would even tell. The nearest town was miles away, and the locals we had met were friendly but reserved, keeping to themselves. That night, the atmosphere in the farmhouse was tense. We tried to carry on as usual, but the discovery of the burial ground weighed heavily on our minds. As we sat down to dinner, the sounds from the woods seemed louder, more insistent. It was as if the forest itself was alive, whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. After putting the kids to bed, Emily and I sat in the living room, discussing what to do next. "We can't stay here," Emily said, her eyes filled with worry. "Something's not right about this place." I nodded, feeling a knot of fear in my stomach. "We'll leave first thing in the morning. We'll pack up and go back to the city." But that night, our plans were disrupted by a series of events that would haunt us forever. Just past midnight, we were jolted awake by a loud, piercing scream. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a mixture of agony and rage that seemed to echo through the entire valley. Emily and I rushed to the kids' room, finding them wide-eyed and terrified. "Did you hear that?" Abby whispered, clutching her stuffed bear. We nodded, our hearts pounding. The scream was followed by a cacophony of other noises, footsteps, whispers, and a low, mournful chanting that seemed to come from all directions. It was as if the entire forest had come alive with the spirits of the dead. We huddled together in the living room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The noises grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like the walls of the farmhouse were closing in on us. Objects began to move on their own, chairs sliding across the floor, books falling off shelves. The air grew cold, and a sense of dread filled the room. "We need to leave. Now," I said, my voice trembling. We grabbed what we could and rushed outside, the sounds of the forest following us. The night was dark and oppressive, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. As we made our way to the car, the ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and the chanting grew louder, more insistent. We drove through the night, the haunted hollow fading into the distance. The farther we got from the farmhouse, the quieter the noises became, until finally we were enveloped in an eerie silence. We didn't stop until we reached a motel several towns away, where we collapsed in exhaustion, our minds reeling from the night's events. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We spoke to locals, historians, and even paranormal investigators, but no one could provide a clear explanation. The farmhouse remained empty, a dark, silent reminder of the haunted hollow. We returned to the city, our lives forever changed by the experience. Lucas and Abby had nightmares for weeks, and Emily and I found ourselves jumpy and on edge, constantly looking over our shoulders. The memory of the cryptic carvings, the ancient burial ground, and the relentless supernatural occurrences haunted us, a chilling reminder of the dark secrets buried in the hills of West Virginia. Years later, we still talk about that summer, the haunted hollow that drove us from our dream home. We never went back, and we never found out the true nature of the spirits that haunted the farmhouse. But the experience left an indelible mark on us, a lingering fear that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried in the shadows of the past.